Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. I work at a museum, not one of the famous ones. We don't have a dinosaur skeleton in the lobby or a gift shop that stays busy year-round. We do school field trips on Tuesdays and Thursdays. We host traveling exhibits when we can afford to book them. And about half the time the vending machine on the second floor eats your dollar and gives you nothing. I move crates. I build display cases. I fix things when they break. I've done this for 4 years and I'm good at it. That's the whole resume. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand what kind of person I am before I tell you what happened. I'm not the kind of person who looks for strange things. I'm not the kind of person who gets spooked easily. I'm the kind of person who shows up on time, does the work, and goes home. The kind of person who, when something strange happens, tries to find the boring explanation first. I tried very hard to find the boring explanation for this. I want you to know that. The exhibit came in on a Wednesday in October, a traveling collection of Dead Sea Scroll fragments, not the famous batch found back in the 40s, but a second set. A small earthquake near Qumran in 2019 cracked open a section of cave that had been sealed for so long that nobody even knew to look there. The fragments inside were in remarkable condition. Scholars were apparently losing their minds over them. I wasn't losing my mind. I was building the display cases. The museum was proud of booking this one. Our director sent an email to all staff with 3 exclamation points in the subject line, which was 3 more than she had ever used before. I read the email, filed it away, and went back to work. The night crew for setup was just me. I prefer it that way. No one asking questions, no one trying to make conversation while I'm measuring. I had the translation panels to mount, and the lighting to adjust, and the cases to level, and it took most of the night. At some point around 11, I got bored enough to read the panels while I worked. I'm not an archaeology person. I didn't know anything about the Dead Sea Scrolls before this job, and I don't know much more now. But the panels were right in front of me, and reading them was better than the silence. Most of it was the kind of text I expected: historical context, photographs of the fragments under magnification, notes from the translation team about which sections were still being worked on, standard exhibit stuff. But about halfway through the 4th panel, I stopped walking and just stood there reading. The fragments made repeated reference to a structure. The scholars had spent a lot of the panel explaining why this was unusual, because nothing in any other historical record from that region and that period mentioned anything like it. No ruins had ever been found. No other text referenced it. As far as anyone could tell, the building had never existed, but the scrolls described it in more detail than they described almost anything else in the collection. And the way they described it was strange. They didn't talk about the size of it or what it was built from. They talked about what it did. The translation read that the structure existed where the second world presses closest to the first. I read that line, and then I read it again. I figured it was religious language, the kind of thing that sounds profound when you translate it from something ancient, but probably just meant something like a holy place, or close to God. I finished mounting the panel and moved on. I packed up my tools around 1 in the morning and walked back through the building toward the loading dock. Same route I take every night. Long hallway, left at the water fountain, right past the storage room, out through the back. I was halfway down the hallway when I realized it was longer than it should be. Not by a lot. Not so much that I stopped immediately. I just had the feeling you get when you're driving a familiar road and something seems slightly off, and then you realize a stoplight changed color or they trimmed a tree. That low-level wrongness that your brain picks up before your eyes do. I slowed down and looked at the end of the hallway. There was a door there. Not a closet door, a real door, full size, wooden, with a round brass handle that had gone dark with age. It looked like something from an older building, something from decades before our last renovation. I stood there and stared at it for a while. Then I turned around and went out the front entrance instead. I told myself I was tired. It was 1 in the morning, and I had been on my feet for hours. I told myself I had probably just never noticed that door before. I'm not sure I believed either of those things, but I didn't have a better explanation, so I went home. The exhibit opened the following Monday. We started getting school groups right away. I went back to my regular routine, handling deliveries and doing repair work and staying out of the way of the tour guides. I noticed the painting on Tuesday. It hangs in the main lobby, near the front entrance. Large landscape, very old. 2 figures standing in the background on a hillside. I had walked past it so many times I couldn't have told you what color the sky in it was. It was just part of the wall to me by that point. On Tuesday morning, I walked past it and something stopped me. I turned and looked at it for a long time. The 2 figures in the background were closer to the edge of the hill than I remembered. I was certain they had been closer to the center. I was so certain that I stood there for almost a full minute, trying to find any angle where they looked like they were in the right place. They didn't look wrong to anyone else. I know this because I asked Gordon, my co-worker, to come look at it with me. I told him I thought something was off with the painting. He looked at it, shrugged, and said it looked fine. I asked if he thought the figures had always been standing that close to the edge. He said he had no idea. He'd never really looked at the painting. That was a reasonable answer. I let it go. 3 days later, I found a newspaper in the break room. Someone had left it on the table. I picked it up while I was eating lunch, and one of the inside pages had a short piece about the anniversary of a historical event, something that had happened in the early 1970s, a decision made by a government official that changed how a particular international situation played out. I remembered this event differently. Same outcome, same general shape. But in my memory, it happened in a slightly different way, with a different person making the key call. I've been interested in that particular period of history since high school. I know it reasonably well. I asked Gordon about it the same way I'd asked about the painting. Framed it as a trivia question, casual, like I was just checking. He told me the same thing the newspaper said. I asked 2 other people at the museum that week, same casual framing. They all remembered it the way the newspaper did. I sat with that for a while. Dr. Petra Lund was the lead scholar traveling with the exhibit. She was in her late 40s, tall, very direct. The The kind of person who answers questions you didn't quite finish asking because she already knows where you're going. She was happy to talk about her work. Most people in the building weren't that interested, so when I started asking questions, she seemed almost relieved. I didn't tell her anything was wrong. I just asked about the structure in the scrolls, what she thought it actually was. She leaned against the wall and looked at the translation panel for a moment before answering. She said that was the question nobody had managed to agree on. The majority of scholars thought the structure was symbolic, a poetic way of describing a place where important decisions were made, a temple or meeting house, given spiritual weight through the language of the text. She said there was a smaller group that thought the language was being used literally, that the writers were actually trying to describe a physical phenomenon, a place where something happened that they didn't have better words for. I asked her which group she was in. She smiled and said she had learned to stop saying that out loud. Then I asked her about the earthquake, whether it was unusual. She said yes, actually. The section of cave it opened had been sealed by a collapse so old and so complete that there was no geological reason to expect anything behind it. She said the archaeologist on site the day it happened described it as finding a room inside a wall that should have been solid. She said in any other year, with any other earthquake in any other location, those fragments would have stayed sealed in the dark forever. She said, in a slightly different version of things, those scrolls simply don't exist. Nobody ever finds them. She said it the way you say something that is interesting but doesn't keep you up at night, like a fun fact. I nodded and thanked her and went back to work. That night, I lay awake for a long time. On a Thursday morning 3 weeks into the exhibit, my co-worker Felix looked at me like I was a stranger. Felix had been at the museum for 2 years. We ate lunch together most days. We had a running joke about the broken vending machine on the second floor, how it had been broken since before he started and would probably still be broken when we were both dead. He was a good co-worker, easy to be around. That Thursday morning, I walked into the break room and said good morning, and he looked up from his coffee with a polite blank expression, the kind you give someone you don't know. He said good morning back in a voice that was perfectly friendly and completely empty of recognition. I thought for a moment that he was joking. Felix liked to mess around. I waited for the punchline. He went back to his coffee and pulled out his phone. I went about my morning. I avoided him because I didn't know what else to do. 4 hours later, he found me in the storage room and made the vending machine joke. He asked if I'd caught the game the night before. He was completely normal. He was completely, entirely himself, and he had no memory of the morning being anything other than ordinary. I didn't say anything about it. I still haven't. That evening, I went back to the exhibit. I walked slowly along the translation panels, reading everything again. Near the end of the hall, Petra caught up with me and told me her team had finished translating a damaged section of one of the fragments they had been stuck on for weeks. New text had been added to the last panel. I stood in front of it and read, "The structure was built or called into being to hold open the place where the choice was not made." I read it 3 times. Then I stepped back and looked at the fragment photograph on the opposite panel. A piece of ancient material under glass, thousands of years old, translated by people with advanced degrees who had dedicated their careers to this. I am not a religious person. I don't think about fate. I've never been particularly interested in the big questions about why we're here or what things mean. But standing in that quiet exhibit hall, reading that line, something settled into me. Not a dramatic feeling, not the kind of scare that makes your heart pound, the quiet kind, the kind where your body understands something before your brain catches up. And by the time your brain gets there, it just nods and says, yeah, I know. After that, the wrongness got smaller and quieter and more consistent. A street I had driven down my entire life had a building on it that I would have said confidently had not been there a month ago. Not a new building, old brick, weathered, with a sign that had been there long enough to fade. I asked Gordon if it had always been there. He looked at me the way you look at someone who just asked if the sky was always blue. I drove past that street every day for a week. The building was always there, solid, old, permanent. I thought about the newspaper article and the painting and Felix's blank eyes. I thought about Petra saying those fragments would have stayed in the dark forever in a slightly different version of things. I thought about the door. I stayed late one Thursday finishing repairs on a display case near the back of the building. By the time I was done, the museum had been empty for 2 hours. I packed up my tools, turned off the lights in the exhibit hall, and started the walk back to the loading dock. The hallway was long. I knew it immediately this time. Not the slow, creeping realization from the first night. Immediate. Like stepping outside and knowing it's going to rain without seeing a cloud yet. I stopped walking and looked at the far end. The door was there. The brass handle had gone even darker than I remembered. The wood around the edges looked like it had been there for a century. I stood at my end of the hallway for a while, long enough that I had time to think about turning around and going out the front entrance again and going home and forgetting this. I didn't turn around. I walked the length of the hallway. It took longer than it should have. The overhead lights buzzed softly. My footsteps were too loud. I reached the door and put my hand on the handle. It was cold. Not building cold, not metal cold. The kind of cold that doesn't have a temperature explanation. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. It didn't open into another room. It opened outside. My first thought was that this was impossible because there was no exterior wall at this end of the hallway. My second thought left immediately because what I was looking at took up all the space in my head. It was the city, my city, the same street grid, the same general skyline, the same sky overhead going dark blue with early evening, but wrong in ways that started small and stacked up fast. The cars parked along the street had a slightly different shape to them, like someone had made one design decision differently back at the factory and it rippled through every model on the market. A building I had looked at my whole life, a tall one, a landmark, was not there. The skyline had a gap where it should have been. In its place was something else. Taller, darker, a kind of architecture I didn't recognize. Not alien, not impossible, just from a different set of decisions than the ones that built my city. The street lights were a warm yellow instead of white. I stood in the doorway and listened. There were people on that street, cars moving a block over, normal city sounds. Nobody looked at me. Nobody looked up at the door I was standing in. The wind moved through that street the same way wind moves through any street. And underneath all of it, I could hear something else, a sound like a very large building under pressure, like old wood holding a weight it has been holding for so long it has almost forgotten it is work. I stood there for what felt like a full minute. What I understood in that doorway was not something I figured out step by step. It arrived whole, the way understanding sometimes does when you stop trying to think. The structure the scrolls described was never a building in a desert. The scholars arguing about temple locations and ceremonial halls and symbolic language were all looking at the wrong part of the text. The structure wasn't a place. It was this, what I was standing in the middle of, the press of one version of history against another, at the points where a decision was made or a decision was left unmade, and both outcomes left a mark on the world. Those fragments, found because of an earthquake that had no business happening, described something that existed in the negative space of choices, and the exhibit, the translations, read aloud every day to school groups and tourists. Petra's team working through damaged sections and updating the panels. All of it had been doing something. Not deliberately. Nobody meant for any of this. But something that old responds to being spoken aloud, responds to being seen. The fragments had been sitting in the dark for thousands of years, and then suddenly they were under glass and lit up, and hundreds of people were reading about the place where the choice was not made. And somewhere in this building, a door opened. I pulled the door shut. The cold left the handle slowly. I stood with my back against it for a moment, and then I walked back down the hallway. It was the right length. It is always the right length once the door is shut. I've thought about that a lot since then. I went out the front entrance and I sat in my car for a while before I drove home. The exhibit ran for 2 more weeks. Thousands more people walked through it. The tour guides read the panels aloud twice a day. Petra's team finished their final translation notes and packed everything up on a Friday morning. She shook my hand before she left and thanked me for the conversations. I said good luck with the research. After the fragments shipped out, the museum went back to normal. School trips on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The broken vending machine. Felix making the same joke about it. The main lobby quiet in the afternoons. The hallway is always the right length now. I check every night when I leave. I don't know exactly what I'm checking for. I don't think the door is coming back. I don't think that's how it works. But I check anyway. Most things went back to the way I remembered them. The painting in the lobby looks right again. Or maybe it always looked right, and I was wrong before. I'm not sure which answer I prefer, so I try not to think about it. One thing didn't go back. There is a small plaque near the front entrance of the museum. Bronze, mounted to the wall, gives the founding date of the building. I have walked past it thousands of times. I know what it says the way I know my own address. It said 1887. It says 1886 now. I have stopped in front of it 6 times. I've looked it up online. Every record, every city document, every local history article says 1886. There is not a single source anywhere that says 1887. It is as if 1887 was never the answer, as if the plaque always said what it says now, and I simply misread it every day for 4 years. Nobody at work thinks this is worth talking about. I mentioned it to Gordon once. He glanced at the plaque and said it said 1886. What was the question? I said never mind. That was the right call. Before the exhibit was packed up, I went back one last time to read the final section of the translation. The part Petra's team had finished the night before they left. It was added to the last panel in smaller text than the rest. I read it. I didn't write it down. I didn't need to. Some things you read once and they're just there from then on, taking up space whether you want them to or not. The last line of the fragment read, in rough translation, "The house does not close. It only rests. I work at a museum. I move crates and fix display cases and walk the same hallways I have walked for 4 years. I go home at the end of the night and I come back the next morning. The hallway is always the right length. So far.